Timothy Burns, aka Tim, checked his phone after leaving a message for his wife of 5 years, Candace, who liked to be called Candy. He'd just signed a service contract with a big California company that had offices nationwide. He knew his boss, Jake Hudson, would be thrilled because the new contract meant his IT firm would grow a lot and he'd get a big pay rise. Maybe now he and Candy could finally start a family, but he couldn't shake the doubt that had crept in after his camping trip with Jake just over a week ago. Candy seemed off somehow. When they got back, Candy seemed distracted and was snapping at him. But that wasn't all. When they got home and threw their clothes into the laundry basket, he noticed something odd in the gusset of her underwear. He picked them up and found that whatever it was had hardened and had a very distinctive smell. Then he noticed a distinctive smell. It was like his world was falling apart. He was determined to uncover the truth. He visited an attorney to explore his options. He would be heading to the West Coast soon. If Candy had cheated, it would end their marriage. "Are you sure your wife is cheating on you?" Ruby Hawkins asked. A family lawyer and divorce specialist recommended by a friend who had just divorced his wife for cheating. Tim replied, "I need to know. If she is, I want a divorce." Most divorces in this state happen without anyone being at fault. Ruby explained, "You can file on the grounds of infidelity, but you'll need." Tim wanted solid evidence like photographs or videos. Ruby said she could hire an investigator to follow her and find out for sure. Tim agreed. He also asked what he could expect during a divorce. Since she earns about the same as him from his teaching job, he likely wouldn't have to pay child support. Ruby explained that since neither of you own any property and you don't have any children, your assets will be split 50-50ths. You'll keep your pension and she'll keep hers. If we can prove infidelity, we'll use that to secure a favorable outcome. I'll start the paperwork and send it once we have the evidence. Tim said, "Let's do it. I'll be out of town for about 3 days, so I think that's when she'll probably do it." She'll probably do it when she's in town for about 3 days. Ruby called her investigator, Marvin Johnson, who suggested Tim install a tracking app on her phone. He also gave Tim a device to record phone calls on his landline and an audio recorder to hide in her purse. Tim hated doing this, but he needed to know. There were other signs too. Ever since the camping trip, Jake had been more arrogant and condescending, almost like he knew something Tim didn't. Tim held out for a week and Candy drove him to the airport, kissing him goodbye. "I'll call you this evening after dinner," he said. "Okay, honey," she replied. "Have a good flight." On the first night Tim was away, he called Candy as he'd said he would. He was surprised when she told him she'd be working as a waitress at a party Jake was hosting that evening. Candy said that one of the waitresses was sick and Jake asked if she could fill in. He hadn't mentioned any plans earlier. He promised to pay her $150. Candy said, "I could use the extra money since I won't be back to work for a couple of weeks." Tim knew classes would start soon and she needed the money, but something felt off. He asked, "Okay, go ahead, but be careful and tell me about it tomorrow." She replied, "You know I love you, right?" Tim said, "Yes, and I love you too. Good night." After ending the call, a knot twisted in his stomach. He called the investigator. "I wanted to let you know that Candy was asked to waitress at a party at Jake Hudson's house." He said, ending the call, that he'd called Candy on her mobile, but she didn't answer. He also tried her home number, but only got the answering machine. He told himself she hadn't spent the night with Jake, but he was wrong. He got an email from Marvin that day saying Candy had spent the night at Hudson's house. The email said she was still at Hudson's house. "I've attached a couple of photos, but be warned they are quite graphic. I will give you my full report when you return." Tim opened the attachments and his heart sank. His beloved wife of 5 years had had sex with 3 men. Oh, no. 3 men. Men he'd once considered friends. His hand started to shake and tears flowed from his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. He tried calling her again, but it went straight to voicemail. He also called his home phone, but only reached the answering machine without leaving a message. He went to the hotel bar to drown his sorrows the next morning. He checked the tracker and found that Candy's phone was still at Jake's house, so he went there to look for her. Marvin had already checked and confirmed that she was still there. He also got an email with 2 more photos of his wife. The photos were the same as the previous ones, but there were men there, including Jake, his son Mike, and 5 more of Jake's IT company employees. He'd once seen them as reliable colleagues, but he didn't recognize the other 3 and assumed they were Mike's friends. He'd finished his business with the California client contract in hand and checked out of the hotel. He caught an early flight home and took a taxi from the airport. When he arrived, he noticed that Candy's car was missing. He checked the tracker and saw that her phone was still at Jake's house. He went inside, changed clothes, and called Ruby's office. He was surprised when her receptionist said she was available and could he arrange to meet Candy in the afternoon. He called her on her mobile and was surprised when she answered sounding out of breath. She said, "Hello, it's me, Tim." He replied, "Where are you?" "I'm home." She answered, "I'm just finishing up a few things before class starts." He was taken aback by her blatant lie. "I see," he said. "Well, I'm done." "Done. I'm in California and I'm heading home." "Oh, okay," she responded. "I missed you so much. Call me when you land and I'll pick you up at the airport." Candy looked at the phone after Tim ended the call. He always ended calls by saying he loved her, but this time he didn't. His voice didn't sound friendly either. She had planned to go home after the first night, but lying undressed between Jake and his son felt too good to leave. She decided that she owed it to herself to enjoy this while it lasted. She reasoned that when classes started again, it would all end. Tim would never know, so she spent the next day and night with Jake and his son, Mike. That second day, Jake went to work for a few hours, but Mike kept her busy and even arranged for several of his friends to join them when Jake returned home. When she got back home, she was having sex with Mike on Jake's bed. When they finished, Jake looked at her and said with a cheeky smile, "Maybe I should send your husband away more often." "My classes are resuming soon," she said. "I won't be available for a week." "I wouldn't dare do anything like that while he's." Jake asked, "Why are you still at home?" "Maybe he'd enjoy seeing how real men treat you for a change," suggested Jake. Both Jake and Mike laughed. "I had a great time," she admitted, "but I still love Tim and I don't want to hurt him." "Maybe I can arrange for him to be sent away for the weekend," suggested Jake. "Then you can come and play," she replied. "With us sounds funny," she said, "but at some point he'll find out Tim isn't a fool." "You know, don't worry," Jake said, picking up his video camera. "I'll handle Timmy. There's just one thing." "What is it?" "I don't want you to have lovemaking with him anymore," Jake said. "You belong to us," she replied. "Understood," he said, "but how will you manage?" "I'll make sure she gets that message across." Jake said, "Come up with an excuse like I have a headache or something." "Okay, I'll try," she replied. Later that day, several of Mike's friends came over and had their turn with Candy. Jake invited a few single guys from the group. She was now officially the party promiscuous. Tim was shocked when he saw all the evidence Marvin had collected. There were photographs and 2 DVDs of videos showing his wife performing various acts with several men. He felt his love for her fade as he watched her engage in acts she would never do for him. Ruby consoled him as best she could. She could, but it was a lost cause. How could she just like that turn into such a traitor after 5 years? He wondered what he had done to deserve this, and what about Jake? He had considered this older man a friend, but now he knew better. He said, "I'll go ahead and file for divorce citing infidelity." Ruby said, "If you want, I can also file a lawsuit for alienation of affection against Jake and the men you work with. These lawsuits don't usually go very far, but I think we can get a good settlement." "Do what you have to do," Tim said. "Just don't do anything stupid," Ruby cautioned. "I don't want to bail you out of jail," Tim shook his head. "Don't worry," she replied. I won't. When can you get the documents ready to ship? I can have everything ready to go in just a couple of days. In the meantime, try to act normally around your wife. I'm not that good an actor, Tim admitted. I will never touch her again. God only knows what she got from all those men. Tell her you're not. Ruby suggested that this would give him some time to think. Tim nodded and said okay. As he sat in his car, he realized that there was no way he could work for Jake again. He couldn't bear the presence of men who had betrayed him. He took out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He dialed the number he wanted and hoped for the best. Carlson said the man on the other end said, "John, this is Tim Burns." Tim said, "John, how are you?" JN asked if it could be better. Tim said, "Listen, is the vacancy at Empire still open?" John Carlson, CEO of Empire, had been trying to get Tim on board for some time, but Tim felt he needed to stay with Jake out of loyalty, but that was gone now. "Have you finally decided to join a reputable company?" "Yeah, something like that. Some things caught my attention and I realized I could no longer work there." "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there anything I can do?" "Just give me a job. I promise. I'll work just as hard for you as I did for Jake, of course." "Can you start on Monday?" "Absolutely. Why don't you and your wife come over tonight and try Rose's famous lasagna? We can catch up and I can discuss the compensation package with you." "I'd love to, but unfortunately I can't bring my wife." "What's going on?" "I don't want to go into detail over the phone. Tim said he could explain more tonight if you want." "Of course." "Tim," JN said, sounding concerned, "you know Rose is a licensed counselor. Maybe she can help you if you want." "That actually sounds good." "JN, I appreciate it." Tim said okay. John said he'd call Rose and let her know. "Can you come over at 6:30 p.m.? Tim said, "Of course. Today at 6:30. "Thanks again, buddy." "With pleasure." They ended the conversation, and Tim felt a huge weight lift off his shoulders. He started the car and headed home. When he got there, he noticed Candy still hadn't returned from Jake's house. He grabbed his briefcase and went inside. After taking a shower and changing clothes, he sat down at the computer to write his resignation letter. Candy finally arrived around 5 p.m. She saw her husband at the computer and went to kiss him, but he turned away, so she ended up kissing him on the cheek. She looked at him before speaking. "Everything is fine," she said. "I don't feel well," he replied. "Maybe it's jet lag or something." "I don't know," he said. "I'll sleep on the futon when I get back tonight." "Will you come back?" "Where are you going?" she asked. "I'm meeting someone for dinner," he said. "You're seeing someone else, aren't you? You mean, am I cheating on you?" "No, I never cheated on you in all the time we were together, and I have no intention of doing it now." "Can you say the same?" She looked shocked. "Does he know?" "No, he could never have found out." "So how was your trip to California? How was your little job at Jake's house?" "Everything went well," she said. "Even when it was hard, it was still fun." "I bet," he said flatly. He looked at his watch before speaking again. "I guess I'll go," he told her. Before saving his work and turning off the computer, he stood up, walked past her without a word, and headed to the master bedroom to change into something less casual. When he came out, Candy was sitting on the sofa. "How long will you be gone?" she asked. "I don't know," he replied. "Don't wait up for me." "Bye," he said, grabbing his keys and heading to the door. She couldn't help but notice that he didn't kiss her or say he loved her. He always did when leaving the house. She picked up the home phone and called Jake, unaware that the conversation was being recorded. "Jake," she said. "I think he knows something." "What makes you say that?" he asked. "You think that Jake didn't touch me at all," she said. "Normally he always kisses me and says he loves me, but he didn't. He seemed so cold and just left saying he had a dinner appointment with whom Jake asked. He didn't say no." "Jake, What if he knows? What if he plans to leave me? So what if he does? He'll be pretty busy, so he won't be home much. But I don't want to lose him, Candy said. I love him, Jake laughed. Yes, you've shown us all how much you love him over the past 2 days, haven't you? Jake asked. It's not funny. I know what I did with you guys, and yes, I liked it, but I still love him. I don't want to lose him. Exactly, said Jake. Let him get this out of his head. After a while, he'll come around. If he doesn't, well, we can do something about it too. You're not going to hurt him, are you? She asked. We just have to show him how things will be from now on, and you will help make this happen, Jake said. When the time comes, you will help us explain everything to him. Remember who you belong to now. I'm sure you wouldn't want the school board to see the video footage we have, Candy said. You wouldn't dare, Candy said. Oh yeah, but I'd love to, Jake replied. I have a video of you on a hike and plenty of videos of you in very compromising positions, Candy said. Your rear literally belongs to me, so you need to keep little Timmy in line, Jake said. I give in, okay, Jake? But don't hurt him, Candy replied. I won't, Jake said, laughing. Goodbye, Candy said, hanging up. The story house where John and Rose Carlson lived. He got out of the car, grabbed a bottle of wine he'd picked up on the way, and went to the door to greet them. Come in, Tim, John, he said with a smile and thanks. This will be put to good use tonight. He led Tim to the dining room where Rose was waiting with her lasagna. Tim, please meet my wife, Rose, John said. Rose, Tim, this is my wife. This is Tim Burns, our new customer service rep. Tim shook Rose's hand while John opened the wine. Nice to meet you, Tim, Rose said with a smile. Glad to meet you too, Rose, Tim replied. Please call me Rose, she said. Mrs. Carlson sounds so official, Tim commented. They took their seats at the table, and Rose served lasagna while John poured the wine. Tim had never tasted such delicious lasagna and expressed his gratitude. Tim said, This is the best lasagna I've ever eaten. I'm glad you like it, Rose said. This is one of my signature dishes, so Tim, I don't want to pry, but I'm curious as to why you decided to leave Jake so quickly. John said, Something happened. Tim nodded before starting, Yeah, something happened. Please, Tim, tell us about it. Tim took a moment to collect his thoughts before telling them the story. Tim told them the story. That's pretty chilling, John said. I really sympathize with you. Something similar happened to me, but the circumstances were different. So what are you going to do now, besides changing jobs? I've met with a lawyer and I'm filing for divorce, Tim said. My lawyer says it will be an even split. What about counseling? Rose asked. I don't know, Tim said. What made Candy change like that? I never thought she was promiscuous. How are you coping with all this? Rose asked. Not too well, I replied. Tim said his lawyer advised him to try to act normally around Candy, but it's very difficult. I can't even look at her. Maybe you should see a psychologist, Rose suggested. I can do that, Tim replied. Rose is the best in the John said. I think she can help you get through this if you want. Plus, it's included in your benefits package, which is definitely a plus. Tim said, laughing, I'm serious. Tim thought about the proposal for a moment. Okay, I'll do it, he said. John smiled and patted Tim on the shoulder. Good man, he said. I'll make sure you have the time you need for consultation, to coordinate with Rose, and to let me know what you come up with. I'll do that. Thanks, Tim, he said. Now, if you don't mind, Tim and I will go to my office to discuss his new job. At all, she replied with a smile. I'm looking forward to working with you too, Tim. Thanks. Tim said, standing next to JN. They moved to John's home office, where he poured them each a glass of brandy. They spent the next 2 hours discussing his new role. By the time they finished, Tim felt like he was taking control of his life again. He shook John's hand and headed back home. It was around 10. It was 10 p.m. When Tim arrived at his house, he saw that the lights were still on. He hoped Candy was there alone. He got out of the car, walked into his house, and saw Candy sitting on the sofa. "How did your meeting go?" she asked. "It went well, thank you. Now, if you don't mind, I'll go to bed." "Good night." He went into the second bedroom, where his computer was, and began to undress. "Are you sleeping here now?" Candy asked from the door. Tim said, "I'm still not feeling well, so I'll sleep on the futon." "Is this a problem?" No, I guess not." The next day, Tim got up before Candy and got his resignation letter ready. He poured himself a cup of coffee and saw Candy's purse on the kitchen table. He grabbed the audio recorder and downloaded the recording of yesterday's phone call. He left the apartment without saying goodbye or telling Candy he loved her. She heard the door close and went back to bed, tears rolling down her cheeks. Tim didn't say much on his way to the office. He greeted his secretary and then went straight to his office and closed the door. He was gathering his things when Jake walked in. "What is this?" Jake asked. "A signed contract from California," Tim replied, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out 2 envelopes. "One is a contract, and the other is your resignation?" Jake said, surprised. "Yes," Tim said. "I'm resigning effective immediately. I believe you owe me a bonus for securing the California deal, along with my final salary and remaining vacation pay." "What the hell is going on? Why are you leaving?" Jake asked, shocked. "I've decided I need to leave," Tim said. "I don't know why." "You think I'm stupid?" "Some things caught my attention and I decided I couldn't work here anymore, so I got a job at another company. I'll be leaving in a few minutes, then heading to HR. Tim, can't we talk about this? I thought we were friends, but you betrayed me and ruined my marriage." "You can find someone else to betray, so that's what this is about," Jake said. "Just so you know, your wife was more than willing to have sex with me. We shouldn't let something like this ruin your career. Just go with the flow for a while. Let Candy sow some wild oats, and when she's done, she'll be all yours again." "Do you really think I would agree to something like that? By the way, how long have you been having fun with her? The others were skiing and Candy really pestered me that day. She even told me I'm bigger than you. She begged me to have sex right there." Tim never turned down Candy. He tried several times, but he just couldn't do it. He couldn't explain why. Candy never mentioned it. "This was so. It was around the time you suddenly asked me to leave to take care of some things at the office, wasn't it, Tim? You wanted to get me out of the way so you could have a bit of a fling with my wife." Jake nodded and grinned, so what he asked Tim wasn't done yet, and this whole thing about hiring her as a waitress. "Was your party just another excuse to get her into bed?" Tim asked. "Yes, it was," Jake replied. "So what?" Jake said, "I'm going to the HR department, so don't worry, I won't bother you." "You can't use this recording," Tim said. "We'll see." "I'm leaving," Jake said. "Goodbye, Tim." "You forgot something," Jake said, picking up the photo of Candy that Tim kept on his desk. "I don't want it," Tim said. "You and your son want it. I'm done with her and with you. Goodbye." With those words, Tim left the office. Jake watched him walk away, wondering what just happened. How did Tim find out what he and his son did to Candy? "What do you mean you resigned?" Candy asked. "When Jake called, he just handed me." Jake said he'd seen the signed contract and resignation letter. He'd also seen the letter Tim had written to Candy. He didn't know how he'd seen it, but he knew what. Candy asked, "What did you say to him?" She wanted to know the truth. Jake said, "I told him about how it was for the first time on the hike." She said, "You're an idiot." Jake said, "Well," he asked. "I told him. He left a photo of you on his desk. He said he didn't need it." She was really upset, so I asked what we should do now. "It's not my problem," Jake said. "You're his wife, so you can handle this." Unless, of course, you want me to step in and make him see the error of his ways. No, she said. You've done enough. Thank you. Stay away from this. I'll deal with it as you say. He replied and hung up. Candy looked at her phone with tears streaming down her face. She didn't want a divorce, but she knew Tim wouldn't tolerate her cheating. She decided to do everything in her power to keep him. She sat on the sofa, head in hands, sobbing over what she'd done. A few minutes later, Tim pulled into the driveway. He saw C's car and looked around for Jake's, but didn't see it. He grabbed his box and briefcase and went inside. He saw Candy on the couch and he went into his office, closed and locked the door, and checked for voice recordings. He found the recording and listened to the conversation between Candy and Jake. He forwarded it to his lawyer and called her back. "Hi, Tim," she said. "I just received your last email. I'm preparing your documents now. When can they be submitted? If you want, I can pull some strings and my BFF can deliver them later this afternoon." "That works," he said. "That will suit me. Thank you." He had no intention of using the automatic pistol, but he didn't want to cause any trouble with Jake or Candy. He walked into the kitchen, put his briefcase on the table, and looked at Candy. "We need to talk," he said, placing the weapon on the table. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, pointing to the weapon. "I hope not," he replied. I just want to be prepared in case your lover decides to break in here." "My lover?" she asked. "Don't play games," he said. "I'm not in the mood for your games," she replied. "Let's sit down and discuss something." "I'm not in the mood for games," he said. "Let's sit down and discuss something." "First things first," he said. "Someone will come by and give you the papers later today." "Papers?" Candy was shocked. "Divorce." She asked why he wanted a divorce. He said he didn't. He said he loved her. Tim said he knew everything about her, her son Jake, and everyone else she'd been having fun with recently. He said he'd filed for divorce on grounds of infidelity. She asked if he had any evidence. Tim smiled. He took out an envelope and laid out several photos, all clearly showing her having sex with multiple men, including Jake. He also had videos and audio. "Would you like to watch?" she asked. "I'll show you the videos and audio," he replied. "Considering the circumstances, I was more than fair. You get no support. I'll give you half of what's in the bank, and we'll each keep our pensions. You can take all your things I've already paid and canceled your credit card for. I have a cashier's check for your half of what's left. There's also a restraining order that says you must stay at least 150 meters away from me, my residence, and my workplace. So, from now until you're served with the documents, you have to. Once you've seen the documents, you have time to pack up your things." "Are you kicking me out?" she asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's pretty much it." "But what if I decide to contest the divorce?" she asked. Tim laughed. "I don't think that would be very wise. What do you think the school board would say if these photos and videos just happen to appear? Do you think the parents of your students would want someone like you teaching their children?" "I don't think so." "You wouldn't dare." Tim asked Candy to look down for a moment before shaking her head no. She said, "I need this job." "Right, that's how it'll be," Tim said. "There are a couple more things you should know. You'll be required to hand over your rings and give up my last name." "Oh my God, you've become a heartless prick, haven't you?" she asked, taking off her rings. "Yes, well, you gave me a good reason," Tim said. I want to know one thing. What made you turn from a loving, faithful wife into this?" She lowered her eyes before speaking. "It happened on the second day of the hike," she said. "You were on the boat, and I was in the tent. Jake walked by and saw me. I'd already undressed and was lying there trying to rest when Jake came in. At first, he seemed embarrassed to see me undressed. We started talking, and then he pulled his pants down, and that was it. So, some guy takes off his pants, and you immediately jump on him, said Tim. That's all it took for you to become a traitor. How many times did you have sex with him on that trip? Twice. The first time was when you were jet skiing, and the second time was when Jake sent you back to the office. Tim shook his head and pointed at the photographs. I see that none of your lovers used any protection, he said. Weren't you worried about getting pregnant or catching something? I'm still taking the pills, she said. That doesn't mean. You can't get pregnant, Tim said. And you can still get sick. Is this what you planned? Oh God, no, she said. Tim shook his head. You know, during our entire time together, I was often pestered by women who, like you, look like goddesses. I refused them all. Do you know why? Because I thought I had a loving and faithful. My wife is at home and I would never do anything to hurt her, but you didn't think about what you were doing. You didn't care how I felt. I hope it was worth it for you now. Pack up your stuff. I expect you to leave when you are served with the documents. Tim, please. She began, can't we turn to a psychologist? Please, I promise. I'll never do this again. Can't you forgive me this time? I will never forgive you for what you did. Tim said his expression was harsher than she had ever seen before. Never. Maybe if you slipped just once, were molested or something like that, I might overlook it, but that didn't happen from the moment Jake pulled his pants down. I'm not sure I can forgive this level of betrayal. Don't you love me enough to get through this? He shook his head. I can't stand the sight of you right now. She burned, threw away, or donated to Goodwill. She was sobbing. She got up and went to the master bedroom to pack her things. Tim watched as Candy pulled out one full garbage bag after another. She stopped and looked at him. She asked, "Can you at least help me carry this to the car?" Tim replied, "No. And remember, everything you leave behind will either be burned or thrown away. This includes photographs and your wedding dress." "Would you burn my wedding dress?" she asked. "My parents paid thousands for this dress." "Well, then you better take it if you don't want it to burn," Tim said, sobbing. She carried the bag to her car. And she came back for another load of stuff. A couple of hours later, she sat down, exhausted. "I can't fit anything else in the car," she said. "Can I come back later for the rest?" "No," said Tim. "You will not be allowed closer than 150 m to this place. Ask your parents if they can collect it. Come and get them. I'll hold on to everything for a few days." "Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it." "Oh, my God. I was just wondering, what am I going to tell my parents?" "Tell them you cheated on me with my boss and others, and I threw you out. They'll disown me if I do this." "That's not my problem, Tim. But it'll be much worse if you try to make me look like the bad guy. You know how your parents feel about lying." There was a knock on the door. "I think it's for you." Candy walked slowly to the door and opened it to reveal the deputy sheriff. "Candace Burns?" he asked. She nodded and said, "Yes, that's me. You can sign the divorce papers now if you want." She nodded and took out the papers. After looking through them, she asked for a pen and signed them. "I'll give this back to the lawyer. You need to leave right now. If you try to return, you will be arrested and sent to jail. You understand, right?" she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked back at Tim. "I'm so sorry." "Yeah, me too," Tim replied. "Bye, goodbye," she said quietly, leaving. The next few days were hectic for Tim. Candy never tried to contact him, but Jake called his home. He called twice and left threatening messages. "Damn it, Tim. I know you're there. If you don't drop this lawsuit, I'll come and kick your freaking back." Tim smiled and copied the voicemail before forwarding it to Ruby, who then notified the local sheriff's department. Candace's parents also called, asking if they could come and get some more of her stuff, if you like. "Sure," Tim said. "Just make sure she's not with you." She has a restraining order, okay? Candace's dad, George, said that with a sigh. When George and Candace's mom, Bernice, arrived, they took what Candace had left behind and used the time to try to convince Tim to call off the divorce. Tim, she made a mistake, Bernice said. Surely you can forgive her and take her back. She loves you. What did she tell you, Bernice? Tim asked. She said she had a fight with your boss, Bernice said. That's all, Tim asked. Well, yes, she said. She didn't go into detail, and we didn't press her. Tim grabbed an envelope. Tim showed them photographs and DVDs, and they were shocked when they saw the photos. I'm sorry she didn't tell you the whole truth, Tim said. As you can see, it turned out to be much worse than she made it seem. Oh my God, Bernice said. I had no idea it was so bad. I'm so sorry, Tim. I don't blame you. George's face turned purple with rage. I'm going to have a long conversation with our foolish daughter, he said. Have you done anything else with these photographs? Tim shook his head. Not yet, but I warned her not to contest the divorce. They sympathized with him for a moment and then finished packing up. The rest of her things were packed up in half an hour. They left the house, giving Tim a warm hug and wishing him all the best. Later that day, Tim was watching TV when there was another knock on the door. He looked through the peephole and saw Jake, Mike, and two of Tim's former colleagues. He walked into his office, grabbed the weapon, and went to answer the door. From the weapon case, he grabbed the weapon and called emergency. He held it behind his back and opened the door just as they rushed inside. Hey, wait a minute! Jake growled. Tim pulled out his weapon and pointed it at Jake, forcing them to stop. You're not really going to shoot us, are you? Jake said. I don't have to, Tim replied. Tim said, do you really want to test the courage now? Just so you know, I already called the emergency services and the police are on their way. If you're here when they arrive, you'll be arrested for violating the restraining order. Jake, I think he's serious, said one of the other men. Jake looked at him, then turned back to Tim. At that moment, they heard a siren nearby and saw flashing red and blue lights. Yes, Jake, I'm serious, Tim said. They turned to leave, but two large uniformed police officers stood in the doorway. Tim lowered the weapon and said, Sir. One of the officers replied, Obey me. Tim did as he was told and placed the weapon on the kitchen table. Table officer, these people are violating the restraining order. Tim said they broke into my house and threatened me. I want them arrested. Do you have a copy of the order? Another policeman asked. Tim nodded. I have it, officer. He took a closer look at the order. After a few moments, he gave it back to Tim and turned to the four men. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, he said. The four men glared at Tim as the officers handcuffed them and read them their rights. Once they were secured, one of the officers turned to Tim. Do you have a? He asked for Tim's license for the firearm. Tim said, Yes, I do. Would you like to see it? Tim pulled out his wallet and showed the officer his driver's license and his NRA firearms training card. The officer nodded after studying the cards. Okay, he said. Be careful with this thing. Do you hear me? Tim said. I hear you. The next 3 months flew by for Tim. He enjoyed working at Empire much more than he ever did working for Jake. Weekly counseling with Rose helped him deal with trust and anger issues. He also joined a gym and worked out 3 days a week. He started taking martial arts classes, mainly for mental discipline. On top of that, he took a diet and exercise course recommended by Rose. The divorce went through the system smoothly, especially since Candy didn't contest it. However, the alienation of affection lawsuits were different. Ruby warned that they might eventually be fired, and 2 of them were. However, the case against Jake came as a surprise to both Tim and Ruby. After hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence presented by Ruby, as well as examining Jake's financial statements, The judge ruled in Tim's favor and ordered Jake to pay $1 million in damages at the end of the trial. The judge didn't hold back in expressing his opinion of Jake. "Hudson, your behavior in this case is unacceptable." The judge said, "You not only took advantage of a man who considered you a friend, but you also misused your position as his employer to deliberately destroy his marriage and family. I also noticed that you have repeatedly violated the restraining order against I'm therefore ordering you to pay $1 million in compensation." "This is highly illegal," Jake's lawyer said, standing up. "Mr. Winthrop, this court finds Mr. Hudson's conduct not only unlawful but absolutely disgusting. The decision stands. Should this restitution be made? Unless your client chooses to spend some time in jail for contempt of court, of course." "My client will pay as ordered," Winthrop said, sitting back down. "Okay," the judge said. "And God help you if that check gets rejected." He banged his gavel. When the hearing ended, Jake wrote a check and gave it to his lawyer, who gave it to the bank. After the judge noted the check, the bank gave it to Ruby, who then gave it to Tim. Tim was surprised that the check was honored by the bank, which meant he could pay Ruby her share of the judgment while working at Empire. Jake's clients let Tim know what was going on. Word got around, and a lot of companies were reluctant to keep doing business with someone who deliberately messed up another man's marriage. They figured that someone who'd destroy a friend's marriage couldn't be trusted with anything. Tim thought that Jake would go bankrupt within a year. Throughout this time, Tim didn't go on any dates, despite interest from several nice women at the company. He felt that he would remain a married man until his divorce was final. Once that happened, he would be free to date. When it was finally finalized, he celebrated with friends from work. A couple of months later, Candy's mother called. "Tim, this is Bernice. Do you have a few minutes?" "Of course, Bernice. What's going on?" "Candy just got her test results. She's HIV positive." "I'm sorry to hear that, Bernice," Tim said. "To be honest, I'm not surprised. We're officially divorced now, so there's nothing I can do about it. She's not covered by my insurance, and I'm not responsible for her. I know Bernie said I was just hoping that maybe you would understand and talk to her a little." "Well, I think I can, but I don't know if I should." "I don't know what good it'll do," he said. "Please just come and talk to her for a few minutes," Bernice begged Tim. He thought for a moment before answering. "Okay, I'll come by for a few minutes." "Thank you very much," Bernice said. Tim drove up to Bernice and George's house and was shocked to see how thin and frail Candy looked. She walked towards him, but he waved her away, saddened. She sat down and invited him to sit on the sofa. "You look good," she said. "Better than I remember. How are things going with you, Candy? New job, new friends, new outlook on life. How are you doing?" "Not good at all. You know I'm HIV positive." "That's what your mother said. I'm sorry to hear this, but to be honest, I'm not surprised. Do you know when you became infected?" "I think it was one of the days I spent at Jake's. I had a lot of unprotected sex with several men." "Does Jake know?" "No. Not yet," she said. "I'll have to tell him so he can get tested too. I'm sure he won't take it well." Tim said, "No, probably not. I ended up paying for it. I had the best husband and lover a girl could ask for, and I gave it all up for something new. I know you hate me and you have every right to, but I don't want to go to my grave without your forgiveness." Tim considered her words carefully. It was the first time he remembered her actually taking responsibility for what she did and acknowledging the impact of her actions on others. He could continue to hate her, but he recalled his sessions with Rose. Tim knew that holding a grudge against Candy wouldn't help him move on. He nodded and said, "Okay, Candy, I forgive you." She cried as she sat in a chair. He thought about pulling her into his arms, but he stopped himself and stood up. She waved him off, saying, "Thank you so much, Tim." She was crying. "This means more to me than you know," she said. "Listen, I want you to find a woman you can love and trust. Marry her and have children. I'm over it. I'm done, but you have your whole life ahead of you, and you deserve to be happy. You know, I'll do that. And if you ever want to just talk, let me know. Okay, she nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. I will, Tim. She said, thank you for coming and talking to me. I've missed you so much these past few months. I miss the woman I married. Tim said calmly. She said that she'd been going through a rough patch lately. Tim asked if he'd hurt her physically. She replied that he hadn't, but that he was being very harsh. She then asked if Tim wanted to be there when she told him about her diagnosis. Tim replied that she should be the one to tell him, and that it was her responsibility. She said that she kept thinking that if she just told him to leave on that first day of camping, they'd still be together. Tim said that it was quite possible, but that he had a feeling that at some point it would. Hugh's been after you for quite some time. I think you're right. She said, look, I'm really tired and I need to rest before I go back. Thanks for coming. This means more to me than you know. You're welcome. Destruction. I will, he said. Just don't do anything stupid. Okay, she smiled. I won't. A couple of weeks later, Tim was sitting on his couch eating dinner and watching the evening news when he heard a report that caught his attention. The bodies of a local businessman, his son, and a woman believed to be the man's mistress were found earlier that day in what police believe was a double homicide. The presenter said that Jacob Hudson, president and founder of Hudson Consulting, along with his son and a woman who has not yet been identified, were found dead. All three had suffered fire-shot wounds. The authorities said that the police are investigating the incident and that more details will be provided as they are released. After recovering from his initial shock, Tim called Bernice. She was sobbing when she answered the phone. Bernice, what's going on? He asked. We just got word that Candy is dead. She said it looks like that prick Jake shot her, then his own son and himself. Oh my God. Tim said, I saw the news report and hoped it wasn't her. I'm so sorry, Bernice said. Is there any idea why this happened? They're not 100% sure, she replied. I'm pretty sure she told Jake about her HIV and he lost his mind. They're now conducting an autopsy. I'm really sorry, Tim said. Sorry, Bernice. Tim said, I never wanted this to happen. I know, Tim. She said, Candy made her own bed and paid for it. It's still hard to lose your only child. I'm just glad you were able to make peace with her. I like to think she's in a better place now. Fine, let me. If there's anything I can do, he said. Thank you, Tim. Candy's memorial service was held a couple of weeks later, and Tim took the day off work to be there with her parents. The autopsy results showed that both Jake and Mike, like Candy, were HIV positive. Candy told Jake about her diagnosis and suggested they get tested. When Jake and Mike learned they were also positive, they shot Hudson Sr. in the head, then his son, and finally themselves. Tim spent several days mourning, remembering the good years they had together. He'd spent a lot of time together, and then one day, out of the blue, he got a visit from Cynthia Stone, another rep who worked on his team. Hello, cowboy, she said. Would you like to join us for happy hour tonight? You look like you could use some company. Tim thought about it for just a moment. He almost refused her, but then changed his mind. What the hell, he said. I could use some good company right now. Of course I'll join you, she said. Well, then, come to Hitchhikers after work. Okay, he said, smiling. I'll be there. Thanks for the invitation, she said. So the cycle of life continues.